Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second annual Women of Odyssey Leadership Forum. We have a tremendous lineup of speakers today who we'll be introducing in a moment. But before we do, I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce the Women of Odyssey initiative and tell you guys a little bit about tonight's panel. First off, I would like to say thank you to IQVIA for their support of the Women of Odyssey initiative. We are incredibly grateful for their support. The Women of Odyssey group started about 2 years ago with the aim of providing a forum where women can come together and share their experiences and discuss the challenges that they face as women working in real-world analytics. And ultimately, what we hope to achieve with the Women of Odyssey group is to work to propose ideas for the Odyssey community on how to support women in science and technology and inspire women to become leaders within the Odyssey community and their respective fields. So last year marked the very first Women of Odyssey Leadership Forum, which was part of the 2019 Odyssey Symposium. So that evening we were joined by Noemi El-Haddad, who is the interim chair of Biomedical Informatics at Columbia University, Yolanda Grigorescu, who is the chief of the Partnerships and Evaluation Branch at the CDC, Janet Woodcock, who is the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA, and Joanne Wallstreicher, who is the chief medical officer at Johnson & Johnson. So these four women who are at the top of their careers joined us for a very engaging evening where they told us about their experiences as female leaders and imparted their wisdom on how to navigate challenges that we all face in our careers. So tonight's event will build off the success of last year's forum, and in addition, we'll also be focusing on intersectionality and discussing the unique challenges that women from underrepresented groups face as they navigate their careers. And ultimately, with tonight's panel, we'll be highlighting the importance of having diversity both in leadership and throughout the research process. So one last thing I want to point out before we introduce our speakers for today, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is one of my personal heroes, is known for saying that she felt that there would be enough female Supreme Court justices when there were 9 of them. So we're still working on the 9 Supreme Court justices, female Supreme Court justices, but I do want to say that at this year's Odyssey Symposium, we had 9 female panelists. So I think RBG would be proud. So with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the talks tonight. So Dr. Ru-fong Cheng will be moderating this discussion and introducing each of our speakers. So Dr. Cheng is the Senior Medical Director of Women's Health at Johnson & Johnson, and she has extensive experience working as an OBGYN and clinical researcher in the pharma industry. So Dr. Cheng works across multiple disciplines and sectors, blending science with development and collective action, and leading the data strategy effort for sex and gender differences to articulate areas of unmet need and improve the health of women. Dr. Cheng's work truly embodies the spirit of the Odyssey Collaborative, and I'm tremendously excited to have her here as our moderator today. So take it away, Ru.
Okay, hello, hi everyone. Welcome, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Hopefully it's not in the morning for you because it would be extremely early. It's truly a privilege and an honor to be your moderator today and to share this virtual stage with this collection of extremely accomplished and esteemed panelists. As Maura said, my name is Ru Cheng. I'm a physician researcher with J&J, and I'm also an advocate for women and women's health. So I'm super excited to be a part of the Women of Odyssey. So our first speaker today is Subha Madhavan. Dr. Madhavan is the director of the Innovation Center for Biomedical Informatics at Georgetown University Medical Center, and associate professor in the Department of Oncology. She is also the chief data scientist in the Georgetown University Medical Center with responsibility for all data-related research initiatives. For her research on brain tumors to collect, standardize, and analyze patient information in the Repository for Molecular Brain Neoplasia Data, Rembrandt, she was awarded the top federal employee recognition of service to America medal in the science and environment category. Dr. Madhavan has led many programs in health data science, clinical informatics, and health IT with responsibility for several biomedical research efforts, including the software development of Georgetown database cancer. a resource for both researchers and clinicians to realize the goals of personalized medicine, and leadership of Lombardi Cancer Center's Biostatistics and Bioinformatics shared resource. She co-chairs the ClinGen Somatic Working Group and leads a group of 40 cancer research organizations in the US to develop guidelines for standardized somatic mutation reporting from clinical labs. Dr. Madhavan has a master's degree in computer information systems from the University of Maryland and a PhD in molecular biology and biological sciences from the Uniformed Services University for the Health Sciences, and received postdoctoral training in computational biology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Just one note, sorry, I forgot to mention at the beginning, after after all the speakers have presented, we will have the option for Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can type them in your chat box for the Q&A, and we'll get to it after all 4 speakers have concluded. So I'm going to turn it over now to Subha Madhavan.
Great, thank you so much, Ru, and thank you to the Odyssey Symposium leadership for inviting me to present at this fabulous leadership forum. I remember listening to the leadership forum last year and being inspired by all the women speakers last year, and so really honored to be speaking this year. So what I'm going to do today in the 15 minutes that I have is quickly share with you 2 stories. One of my stories is pre-Odyssey Era. So this project, Rembrandt project, that Ru kindly mentioned in the introduction, received a team award for the SAMMYs, the Service to America Award, which Dr. Fauci received this year, 2 weeks ago. And yes, we beat the Mars Land Rover for winning this award, and this was almost 10 years ago. And this community, the Rembrandt community, really reminds me of Odyssey, right? And this project has now been active for over 10 years now. And you'll see the timeline that I'll share with you in the second story, which you can sort of compare and contrast. So this all started with an NCI, a National Cancer Institute-led glioma molecular diagnostic study, which began in 2005 with 14 different sites across the United States. And this was the first study to integrate both transcriptome data and DNA copy number data with clinical outcomes in patients with brain tumor. And the real success of this project was the multidisciplinary team of clinicians, researchers, computer scientists, and informaticians that came together to both perform the project over a period of a number of years, to collect the data, to standardize the data, to analyze and publish on this data set, and then ultimately winning the SAMMYs award. So we recently moved this entire data collection into GDoc, a project that I have had the great honor to lead at Georgetown University's Medical Center, the Georgetown Database of Cancer. And Rembrandt, the brain tumor study, has really served as a big motivation for GDoc, and I'll share with you the other cancer studies that Rembrandt has inspired. And this collection was published in Nature Scientific Data. It caught a lot of attention. And we also received a tweet from Vice President Biden at that time, where he called out the Lombardi Cancer Center for making this large brain tumor data set widely available to the research community. And, just to remind everyone, this was all pre-Odyssey era, and, we didn't have the kinds of tools and data standards that we have today. And it took us almost a decade to make this data sort of come alive. And be available to researchers in a standardized form for research purposes. So what has been the impact of GDoc, the Georgetown Database of Cancer? As you can see, there are many other cancer types that GDoc now supports, and we have over 4,000 students who take this course that GDoc is based on. It's a massive open online course, and this project is now inspiring. It started out with brain tumors, but it is now inspiring projects in liver cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, and has really allowed us to connect with the broader cancer research community, both in the United States and also globally. You can learn more about this project at this URL that is shown here. So recently, we took the Rembrandt data set and worked very closely with the FDA. I very much appreciated Amy's comments at the 1 o'clock session here at the symposium about real world data and the significance of real world data, especially now during the COVID era. So we took the Rembrandt data set and worked with Precision FDA to create a biomarker discovery challenge, and recently awarded 3 prizes for the top data scientists who developed algorithms to predict outcomes in patients with brain tumor based on this genomic data. You can learn more about the challenge itself at the Precision FDA website. So that was story number one. The second story I wanted to share with you is, during Odyssey or post-Odyssey era, where, when story one took almost 10 years to come to fruition, the second story, this project was launched in less than 3 months. And this is called R2D2 and C3PO, so appropriately named after the droids in Star Wars, where the whole point is to allow the global research community to ask questions, ask COVID-related clinical questions, and experts across 11 different sites join hands to use their data to respond to these questions. And this entire consortium is completely based on OMOP map data sets, right? So this is what Odyssey is enabling. And I wanted to sort of compare and contrast my story one with story two. So here's a quick example of a question that a researcher asked of this R2D2 project. What is the mortality of patients taking ACE2 inhibitors? And what is the breakdown by age, gender, race, and ethnicity? As the chief data scientist at Georgetown University, I sit in on a lot of data governance meetings where people are wondering about, should I share patient data? Should I not share patient data? Should I only share summaries and so on? This project simply solves that issue. We don't want you to share individual patient level data, but your data is mapped to OMOP in the back end, and you're able to run these OMOP queries and summarize the data and only present the summary data as responses to these questions, which really has enabled many sites to participate in this effort that's led by UCSD. We are a newcomer to this project. Georgetown University and the MedStar Health in the greater Washington, D.C. area. We have recently joined hands with the other 11 sites that have been working on the R2D2 effort. But I wanted to point this community out to this URL. So if you have clinical questions on COVID-19, you can go to covid19questions.org and simply type your information, and no registration is required. You can type in the question that you would like answered. And in a few days, all of these sites will take these prioritized questions, run these queries within their own data sets, and provide a response back. And this is the federated data model. I don't have time to go into the architecture of this, but if you go to the medRxiv and search for R2D2, you can learn about how this project works. So here is a quick response for the ACE2 inhibitor question that I just asked, and running this question across 11 different sites, a summary information could be provided on the covidquestions.org website. And so I mentioned this, a lot of issues around patient level data sharing, but Odyssey enables this federated network. And here is, it does take a village to do projects like these, and here are all the sites that are participating. So again, just to compare and contrast, the first project, it took almost 10 years to launch and bring the data to researchers, and this one, through Odyssey and other standardized protocols and methodologies, was able to launch in a short span of 3 months. So again, you can join the R2D2 effort and learn more about it on medRxiv. So I was asked to share some final thoughts on, as an immigrant who is leading a research organization at Georgetown University. I mean, I always take pride in saying that I came with $300 in my pocket to this country for graduate school, and all the inspiration that I see around me and through this Odyssey-like consortia has really enabled my work here. So I wanted to put a few pointers here to just share my thoughts. I was thinking about it this morning. If I wanted to convey this to my younger self, who came with those $300 in the pocket 20 years ago, what would I say to her? You always have to find the right people to collaborate with, right? So when it's so much hard work, you want it to be fun. And you want to find the right sponsors, and not just mentors, but also people who will open doors for you and people who will connect you to the right organizations, to the right projects. And I always have enjoyed solving problems for others. So when you solve other people's problems, your problem gets automatically solved. So that's a good navigation to kind of work towards. promote others in your field, spend at least 1 hour each week to think strategically about what you're doing and where you want to go. Otherwise, especially now with our 10-hour Zoom and Microsoft Teams sessions, we can sort of be on autopilot. It's important to kind of take a step back and turn off the Zoom and Teams and think strategically about where you want to go in your career and what kind of projects you want to spend your time and effort on. And having a good morning routine always helps, right? It could be meditation or yoga, or it could be reading a book, reading something that really motivates you for the day. And so I think these are some tips that I would like to share with my 20-year younger self, but I wanted to put that out here for all of you to consider. Thank you very much, Ru.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. When we come back to the Q&A, I'm going to ask you more questions about your morning routine, but for now, let's go to our next speaker, Robyn R. Jones. Robyn is a board-certified obstetrician gynecologist, clinician, researcher, integrative medicine specialist, and community leader. And most importantly, perhaps, she's my colleague and also my friend. Robyn has over 15 years experience at J&J. In her current role, she is a senior medical director in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer in the Women's Health Group, where the shared group vision is to better the health of women now and for future generations. And the mission of the team is to deliver life-changing healthcare solutions tailored for women. Dr. Jones is currently leading the strategy for sex and gender data generation and analysis for cardiovascular metabolism and neuroscience therapeutic areas, including the impact of wearable and clinical trial data. Her passion for the health of women includes working with team members on reduction of maternal mortality and strategy. Robyn has been sought out as a leader and a speaker on health disparities for Black women, both within J&J and outside of the organization. She has been featured in print and broadcast media, participated in expert panels, including the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Robyn also mentors young women, serves on the board of Temple University Medical Alumni and the Ivy Legacy Foundation, and holds a leadership position in the Philadelphia chapter of Northeasterners and was a former president of a chapter of her sorority Alpha Kappa Alpha. Robyn has received degrees from Brown University, Temple University School of Medicine, and specialty training at the Medical College of Pennsylvania. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Robyn.
Thank you, Ru. And thank you for the invite to speak to those who are here at the Odyssey Conference. I want to share a little bit of my personal experience, and I will say that two of the things that Ru didn't include was that I'm a boy mom and I am an avid art collector. And I say that because the transition in my career from medical practice really was inspired by the fact that I now had 2 teenage boys and thought it was time to stop delivering babies and potentially do something else that would still be stimulating, new, energizing, and give me a sense of accomplishment. Fortunately, at the time that I entered industry, I had people that I could go to, talk to, find out more about it because I was a novice, knew nothing about industry and what doctors do there. So the opportunity became available for me to shift into industry. And initially, my role was one where I was taking care of those products that impact women's reproductive systems and men and women's urologic systems. But that changed with time. One of the things that did not change till very recently was my view of myself at work. And when I say that, as a Black woman, I often wore a mask. The mask of, okay, now you're at work, and then revealing my authentic self after I left work. And I will say that more recently, that has changed, and I've had the opportunity to always be my authentic self. The other thing is that I entered industry expecting to be only. When I say only, not only the only Black, but the only Black woman in the room. And most of the time that was the case, but not always. So I wasn't expecting anything different. What I didn't anticipate is how the definition of diversity would change during my time at J&J. So initially it really was about those, it seemed to be more based on, more race-based. And as with time, diversity began to include gender differences, sexual preferences. Anyone who wasn't a white man got classified as being diverse and gave the company privilege and permission to say, okay, we're diverse. Not how I was seeing it, not how a lot of my other Black colleagues were seeing it either. But I will say with time, and maybe some of it's just me, you know, I was able to adapt and to have success. Although it was challenging to find out what was going to be the best role for me. And I spent a lot of years just kind of meandering, doing my job, doing it well, but asking myself, what else? If I was going to give some advice to my younger self when I first came into the company, it's very similar, almost exact to what Subha said, in the sense that you have to have a mentor and a sponsor. A mentor is going to help you build skills. A sponsor is going to be at the table for you. A sponsor is going to be able to tell people who you really are, what the work is you can do, be an influencer and a door opener, and always speak on your behalf. So you need to have both, not just one or the other. And also don't assume that a mentor or a sponsor has to look like you. Meaning for me, it has to be a woman, it has to be someone Black, it has to be a Black woman. I have never had a mentor or a sponsor that was not a white man. That has always been what has happened for me, and I've been fortunate. The other thing I will say that I would tell my younger self is be conscious of imposter syndrome. It's not unusual for women, and maybe particularly Black women, to come to the table with everything they don't know, instead of bringing to the table everything you do know, which is what got you where you were in the first place and is going to give you success. Looking at the bigger picture, you know, as Ru mentioned, the work that we do has to do with the health of women. And oftentimes we're looking at racial disparities. And so I'm sure that most of us in our work are looking at how we can be more inclusive, but it also means inclusive when we're doing our research. So inclusive when we're doing clinical trials. And how do we get more individuals of African descent into those clinical trials, knowing full well that there's a lack of trust in the Black community. And I think we know why. And I've had many a conversation coming from the space I'm in now where I say, okay, so Tuskegee was in the 1940s. Henrietta Lacks was in the 1940s. In the 1970s, you know, there were finally regulations and laws that govern clinical trials to protect the participants in the clinical trials. And they hear me, but they're not hearing that. So we have work to do. And recruitment into clinical trials really needs to be an actionable plan. And we really need to gain back that trust. Because in addition to that legacy information, there's also a distrust of the healthcare system, which comes from, you know, years of being neglected and not listened and not heard. And an example I'll say is, let's take the COVID-19 and what's going right now. You know, I recently became very involved. I'll say, well, now it's not so recent. We're 9 months in, but in April, I became very involved volunteering COVID-19 and doing testing, so frontline testing. Because of where I've been the last 15 years, I certainly was not going into ICU and take care of a patient, but I could contribute by testing. And I'm in the Philadelphia area, and a report came out that said in the Black and brown zip codes is where most individuals are being hospitalized and are dying, but the testing is happening in the white zip codes. So I, along with a team of doctors, we had a fearless leader who we started out by borrowing supplies, pop-up testing. We went into the Black communities, into those Black and brown zip codes, and did testing. And what did I learn? That it is possible to gain trust, because those individuals were so grateful that someone would come in and test them. They were scared. They asked me if I was scared. I'm like, yes, I'm scared. I'm out here amidst all this COVID. Of course I'm scared, but I'm here because it's important to me and maybe I can make a difference. Once those test results were received, then those patients could be channeled. When I say channeled, they could get the information about quarantine, about isolation, information to share with their families, as well as what other public health adjustments they needed to make. When we think about disparities, we also have to look at what are the knowledge gaps. I've already mentioned to you what's in the lay community and what are the knowledge gaps, but there are also gaps amongst those of us that are professionals. You know, I think we forget and need to reacquaint ourselves with what it's like to be privileged, knowing that race and racism exist. And I'll make a comment about race and gender. Both are social constructs. So when I walk in the room, I am that intersectionality of race and gender because I'm a Black woman. And there's likelihood to be folks in the room who have a bias, and it's likely to be implicit against me. And they don't realize it, but it's important that we're educating ourselves about biases so that we can make a difference and turn the table on that. It's important to have leaders that look like me. And the reason for that is because I can bring a different perspective to the table. And I think that ideas, innovation, leadership do make a difference because we must have diversity of thought and backgrounds. Vanilla experiences don't lead to multicultural leaders. I also wanted to share, I know that Subha shared her morning routine, and mine, it depends on the day, and maybe I should be more consistent. Sometimes it's in the morning, sometimes it's in the evening, but I do too practice mindfulness. And it could be something as simple as a breathing routine, but something to refocus you, get you back in the moment, realize maybe things aren't as bad as you think they are, help you to build resilience and survive to go to another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. So inspiring. I get to work with Robyn all the time. I'm so lucky. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Deborah Parham Hopson. Dr. Hobson is a senior public health scientist and director, Center for Public Health Systems Innovation at the MayaTech Corporation, which is a small business consulting and technical services firm with a focus on supporting the improvement of public health delivery systems to local, national, and international populations in high need. Prior to joining MayaTech in 2018, Dr. Hopson had a lengthy career with the U.S. Public Health Service, where she was the Assistant Surgeon General and achieved the rank of Rear Admiral as the Senior Health Advisor, and served as the Senior Health Advisor for the Health Resources and Services Administration, also known as HRSA. She also served as the director of HRSA's HIV/AIDS Bureau for many years, during which she was responsible for managing the $2.4 billion Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, which provided funds for medical care, treatment, and support services for over 500,000 uninsured and underinsured people living with HIV disease in the US and the US territories. Dr. Hopson earned her undergraduate degree in nursing and health from the University of Cincinnati and her master's and doctoral degrees in health policy and management from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Gilling School of Global Public Health. Looking forward to her next career, Dr. Hopson recently formed Parham, Hopson & Associates LLC with the goal of providing public health consulting services. Join me in welcoming Deborah Parham Hopson.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I am so pleased to have been invited to be on the panel with such illustrious women. I must say that as Robyn was giving her talk, I thought, did she see my notes? Because many of our experiences are very similar. But when I'm actually speaking, people often ask me, how did you get to be a Rear Admiral in the Public Health Service, and what is the Public Health Service? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, and then sharing some other information about what I would tell my younger self. So as you heard, I did go to nursing school. I'm from Ohio, went to nursing school in Cincinnati, and very quickly realized that I did not want to do bedside nursing in a hospital setting. When I was a senior in nursing school, we did community health nursing, and that's when the public health bug hit me, and I decided to go to public health school. An interesting story is, and I would title this as I took the ticket. Growing up in Ohio, I was very familiar with the Midwest. I applied to 2 public health schools, University of Michigan, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I was going to go to Michigan because that was familiar to me. It was very close to home. But my oldest brother said that's really not the way to make a decision about your a critical life decision. You really need to try to expand your horizon as you start to expand your educational pursuits. So he gave me a ticket to go to North Carolina just to check it out. He said you didn't have to stay there if you didn't like it, but at least go and see it before you turn it down. I went, took the ticket, and the rest is history. I will say that when I arrived in North Carolina, the first time I was living in the South by myself, there was a sign in an adjacent town that said, "Welcome to this town, home of the Ku Klux Klan." And I was shocked, but I decided to forge ahead and found it was really a really great experience and actually prepared me for some of the things that I would see later in life and some of the things that I would experience later in life when I started to provide care and treatment in underserved communities. So I learned that if you take the ticket to new opportunities, there are new ideas, new experiences, and maybe even a new career. One of the things that I also found is that internships really matter. I began my career with 3 different internships. When I was in nursing school, I participated in the COSTEP program. That's the Commission Officer Student Training and Extern Program. It's a program sponsored by the U.S. Public Health Service. I didn't realize at the time that I would have a long career in the Public Health Service. But while I was in that program, I was assigned to the National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where I had the opportunity to work with a young physician, Dr. Tony Fauci, who I believe Subha mentioned in her talk. This was before he became the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And later, when I became the director of the HIV/AIDS Bureau at HRSA, I had the opportunity to work with him when he was the director of NIAID. We actually went to Africa together and were on the team with other public health professionals to help establish, figure out the feasibility of establishing HIV care and treatment programs on the continent of Africa. So you never know where an internship will lead. I also had an opportunity when I finished my master's program to participate in the Presidential Management Internship Program, which is an effort by the federal government to attract more young people into federal service. And I will say that that program continues today as the Presidential Management Fellow Program. And that was when I was assigned to HRSA. Now, it was the first time I had heard of HRSA, but I had the opportunity to provide health services to poor and underserved people throughout the US through a myriad of programs like the Community Health Centers program. I helped to place nurses in underserved areas when I worked in the National Health Service Corps program. I also took the opportunity to work at the Institute of Medicine, where I worked on a study on the nursing shortage. I actually wrote the chapter on how to get nurses to work in underserved areas. So again, another internship led to an opportunity at the Institute of Medicine. So what I'm saying is that internships really do make a difference. After the Institute of Medicine, I did return to HRSA and joined the Commission Corps of the Public Health Service. And the mission of the Public Health Service Commission Corps is to protect, promote, and advance the health and safety of our nation. I love the mission, and I would devote the next 34 years of my career to this professional mission and personal passion. I worked throughout HRSA in many of the programs, but one of the programs that really stuck with me was the HIV/AIDS program. I began working there at first as a program evaluator, and then as the chief of community-based programs, then the division director, and eventually the bureau director, directing the entire program, as you heard in the introduction. So what I would say to those who are looking to enter a career, diverse experiences matter. I talked about internships. They gave me a glimpse into various jobs. I have private not-for-profit experience at the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academies of Medicine. I maintain my clinical nursing skills by working weekends at various local hospitals. But most importantly, I found that what I was really good at and stayed in the track was health policy, program development, and management. It's also important to take jobs of increasing responsibility. I accepted jobs of increasing responsibility throughout HRSA. Like I said, I started as an intern, then worked as a project officer. I'm sure you've heard of those. Had an opportunity to work in a budget shop because I have found that if you have money, you can do many things. Without money, you can't do much in the federal government. And eventually did become the director of the HIV/AIDS Bureau and ended my career as the senior health advisor for all of the HRSA programs. If I were giving advice to my younger self, I would say 3 things. One I've already touched on, which is internships are important. Even if it's not your cup of tea, I would stick with the internship. You never know what connections you will make and what experiences you will have that can help you later in your career. The other is mentorship. Given the nature of public health work, and when I started in the late 1970s, early 1980s, most of the people were white men in the public health service. And as such, as with Robyn, all of my mentors were white men. They were very supportive of me and they advocated for me. Looking back, I would have been more intentional about finding ways to connect with women of color in other professional spaces, even if it was in education or academia, just to have their ear to talk to them about how to navigate these spaces of being one of the few and oftentimes only Black faces and one of the few, if only, female faces. And I took that information and I took that experience so that throughout my career, I have intentionally served as a mentor to many of the junior officers and civilians and continue to do so. The other thing I would tell my younger self is that it's important to set boundaries. As women, we often are used to taking on the world on our shoulders and oftentimes putting our personal needs last. As you heard from the 2 earlier speakers, it's important to have some time to take care of self, because if you don't take care of self, you cannot take care of others. In terms of the disparities that we continue to see in our work, while at HRSA, mainly in the HIV/AIDS field, you heard that I did run the entire Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. And when I started, there were real disparities in terms of who contracted HIV and who lived and died with HIV. Unfortunately, those disparities still exist. In 2018, African Americans or Black Americans accounted for 42% of the new HIV infections, while we only accounted for 13% of the population. Hispanics and Latinos accounted for 27% of HIV new diagnoses, while only accounting for 16.3% of the population. Asians accounted for 2% of the new infections, while they are 6% of the population. Unfortunately, these percentages have not changed in many years. So what do we need to do to change the percentages? What I have found is that the drivers of the disparities in the HIV epidemic in the US are poverty, stigma and discrimination, provider distribution, health status, lack of access to high quality health care, health insurance status, and clinical research. You heard Robyn talk about clinical trials, so I won't repeat that information here, but it is important to have people who are affected by the epidemic be part of those clinical trials. We also need to focus on the social determinants of health. And I would say we need to be more intentional about awarding grants and contracts. I continue to question why we keep funding majority researchers to study minority populations. And lastly, in terms of representativeness, while it's important in both leadership and throughout the public health service, I was honored to become the first Black woman nurse to become a Rear Admiral in the U.S. Commissioned Corps. In doing so, other women, particularly women of color, could see this and know that it was possible. In turn, I am so encouraged to see the diversity and representation of women and women of color in leadership roles in both the U.S. Public Health Service and across various sectors of public health. But more work needs to be done. And with that, I will end and accept questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for sharing that personal message and inspirational comments. I'm going to turn now to our fourth speaker, Vivian Lee. Vivian has many degrees and she's very accomplished as well. She's the author of The Long Fix, Solving America's Healthcare Crisis with Strategies That Work for Everyone. She is the president of health platforms at Verily Life Sciences, an alphabet company whose mission is to apply digital solutions that enable people to enjoy healthier lives. Prior to joining Verily, Vivian served as the Dean of the Medical School and CEO of the University of Utah Healthcare, an integrated health system with a budget of $3.6 billion. During her tenure, she led the University of Utah Health to recognition for its healthcare delivery system innovations that enable higher quality at lower costs and with higher patient satisfaction and superior financial performance. Elected to the National Academy of Medicine with over 200 peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Lee serves on the Defense Health Board of the Department of Defense Board of Directors of the Commonwealth Fund, and is also a director on the board of Zions Bank Corporation, a publicly traded company. Dr. Lee is a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard, received a Doctor of Philosophy in Medical Engineering from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, earned her MD with honors from Harvard Medical School and an MBA from NYU. She was named by Modern Healthcare as one of the 50 most influential clinical executives in 2020. And with that, I turn it over to Vivian Lee.
Thank you so much, Ru. It's really, just as the other speakers have said, it's really such an honor to be a part of this event. And I learned a lot. I was taking notes myself when Subha and Robyn and Deborah were speaking. So thank you for sharing all of your pearls. That's one of the best things about doing these kinds of events, is learning from each other. And I'm delighted to try to share a few thoughts about leadership. And you'll hear some of these themes, that'll be recurring. Because I think many of us have shared very similar experiences in our lives. I thought I would just start by telling you a little bit about my background, but maybe what's not in the bio or on, LinkedIn. So I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma. I'm sure that's what you thought when you saw me. She must have grown up in Norman, Oklahoma. When I was a kid, we were one of just a handful of Asian families in town, even though it was a college town, and we're diehard Sooners fans, just saying in case there are any other Oklahoman out there. And when I was a kid, I really loved math, which made me even more different. And when I participated in things like math competitions, and I'm admitting that I did participate in math competition, I was often the only girl among those who were participating or finishing, among the top finishers, say. And after I went to college, I was fortunate to be awarded this Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford, and I applied to the professor there of medical engineering because that's really what I wanted to study. And we had to arrange in advance a mentor or supervisor. And so I wrote to him and asked him if he would supervise my graduate work. And I'll never forget his letter back. It was pretty memorable. It started, "Dear Vivian, you must be a very capable young man." So you can imagine his surprise when I showed up that day. A few years later, after medical school, I started my residency at Duke. That actually was my first experience living in the South. And I wanted to be a surgeon. It really suited my personality. I ended up becoming a radiologist. But when I arrived at Duke, I was the first woman in about a decade that had matched there in general surgery. Chair was David Saveston, who was rather legendary. And he had a lot of things he believed. And one of the things he believed was that all surgical residents shouldn't wear scrubs out on the floors and everybody should wear whites, white jacket, white pants. Well, when I showed up, and I lined up for my, to get my standard issue hospital gear, I discovered that the hospital only had these very heavily starched white triangular skirts for the women, and trousers were not an option for me. As several of the other women have said, I did feel really fortunate to have mentorship and sponsorship from many capable people, and one of them was Bob Grossman at NYU. I was first his vice chair for research in radiology and then became his chief scientific officer at NYU when he was promoted to the CEO. And it was there that I became really fascinated by challenges of leadership and management. When I joined his executive, the C-suite, I would tell you that I was about 20 years younger, I guess I would say, than my peers. And I was very noticeably pregnant with our third child. So if you want to talk about imposter syndrome, I had that feeling in spades. And having gone to a medical school that was close to 50-50 men and women, had about 20% Asians, about 10% African Americans when I was there. I've now found myself in a completely different environment at national meetings and in rooms where I was often the only Asian and sometimes even the only woman, which was really led to a lot of actually rather memorable experiences. During that time, I became obsessed with, I read just a ton of books about leadership, and actually that's when I took some coursework also in the EMBA program, and I ended up being responsible for developing some leadership development programs for our faculty at NYU. And it was through that and also some of the experiences that I had then afterwards when I moved to Utah, then I really started thinking about diversity in leadership. And there's a book that I often recommend that I actually bought for our leadership team when I was in Utah by a guy named Scott Page. He's on faculty at the University of Michigan, and it's called The Difference. And it has a broader, I was thinking about what you were saying, Robyn, it has a broader definition of diversity. And what he talks about is how diverse leaders can solve complex problems more effectively than just a bunch of smart people who are all pretty similar. And that was the argument that I really had to make, and I hope I was successful in making that argument at Utah, that diversity was really a strategic imperative for our health system, and that to serve the diversity of our constituents, our patients, our research community, even our donors, we really needed more diversity in our own organization. And some of the lessons that I learned then, being in an academic medical center, were captured in an editorial that I wrote with my colleague Carrie Byington. Carrie is a really remarkable Latina leader who now is responsible for UC Health, University of California's health system. And it was an article that was published in JAMA, and it was called Addressing Disparities in Academic Medicine, Moving Forward. And for those of you who are in academics, you might find it, you might not be surprised to know that fewer women are promoted to the full professor ranks. Women generally have fewer publications, they're less likely to have NIH funding, and that's often given as the reason for the scarcity of women at higher and higher ranks. But what you may not know is that there are actually some really interesting studies that maybe explain why some of those disparities have happened. And in fact, in that same issue of JAMA, there was a study that showed that men and women researchers, this is now basic science researchers, really start out remarkably uneven playing fields. The startup packages, which those of you in academics will know are the basic packages you get for supporting your research for the first few years until you get your own grants, averaged $985,000 for the men, so nearly $1 million for the men, compared to $585,000 for the women in one large study. So there were a number of lessons that I learned from studying academic systems across the country, and Carrie and I shared those in this article. And just to summarize them, some of the lessons were first that the leadership just absolutely needs to acknowledge that there are disparities. We thought a lot about how we standardized hiring, thinking about unconscious, or not even thinking about implementing unconscious bias training, standardizing hiring conditions. We thought a lot about transparency and implementing institutional norms in hiring, including norms for startups and salaries. Not leaving everything to negotiation was actually a very important part of our policy. And then other policies with respect to things like how we thought about promotion and tenure, valuing education, mentorship, team-based science, and then thinking about how to support people, for example, around paid parental leave or stopping the clock on tenure. And also really emphasizing mentorship. There was another piece of work that I was very fortunate to be involved with that was also really focused on women in leadership. And it was published in New England Journal of Medicine Catalyst, so it's behind a paywall. But if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to share a copy with you if you just promise not to post it online. Don't get me in trouble. But it was a piece that was co-authored by 28 of us who are part of a group that Joanne Conroy, who is the CEO at Dartmouth, started called Women of Impact. And it was a group of CEOs in healthcare, and it's called Women of Impact in Healthcare on Advancing Equity in the Workplace. And basically, these 28 women shared lessons about the most effective policies and practices to address equity, not just gender, not just race, just equity, broadly speaking, in the workplace. And I'll just read you just one quote of it to give you a sense of the spirit of it. And it goes like this. It says, beyond advocating for women to lean in, we should aim to disrupt underlying biases, challenge normative behaviors, and reimagine the dynamics that result in policies and practices that discriminate against women and other groups. We should lead in. And it's really a call to action for those of us who have responsibility and have the ability to influence the culture of organizations to really challenge what is normative and to reimagine how it could be differently. And one of the people that I call out as a hero for me is Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who I think really embodied this, particularly in the way she's led her nation through a number of crises. And he was reelected this weekend. Since leaving academics, I have moved into the technology world at Verily, and I've been thinking a lot about how we build our products that can address broader issues around improving quality and making care more affordable to all. And I do really believe in the work that OHDSI is doing. I think actually I talk about OHDSI's work in my book, The Long Fix. Actually talk about some of the work that Subha showed about hypertensive medications and really understanding their impact across different populations. I thought that was really brilliant. And I think this is a real opportunity and a responsibility for the private sector to ensure that we don't worsen health disparities, but in fact actually very consciously and thoughtfully try to use digital technologies to address health disparities. And I think unless we're very purposeful, it's going to be difficult to achieve that. So I'm a big champion of that. I do feel like often in these discussions, I know they're more meaningful at a personal level, and I've talked a little bit more about policy. So maybe this is the part about talking to my younger self. So I'll just leave you with maybe 3 lessons that I have lived by, or that I sort of hold. And the first one is to really know yourself, to really understand yourself, to understand your own strengths and your own blind spots. I went through a phase, as I say, I go through these different phases, and one phase where I did every one of those personality tests ever known to man. I encourage you, if you haven't done some of those, to really understand yourself, and then to realize that all those people who are so different from you, they're the people that you also need to manage and lead successfully and design products for and help heal and care for. The second is to play to your strengths and to really build on them. I think it is hard to change people, at least maybe for me, I'm speaking for myself, it's hard to change myself, but this is where finding team members who really complement your weaknesses. So if you're a Myers-Briggs kind of person, I'm an INTJ. And so, you know, I surround myself with people who are much more extroverted, who are really sensitive to the feelings of the organization. You know, they're more creative types. They're just different from me. And of course, diversity isn't just about personality. or about all these different things, but this is one dimension that I think is really important in terms of creating a successful leadership team. And then my third principle that I really try to abide by is to always think about and learn how to bring out the best in others. Listening, understanding, seeing their strengths, helping them manage their weaknesses, bringing out really the best in the people around you. So I think with that, I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Wow, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Vivian. I couldn't help thinking as I was listening to you speak and others about similarities in our experiences. So Deborah, I grew up in Cincinnati. Vivian, same thing. I was a little bit of an outlier in Cincinnati. And when I went to medical school, I wanted to be a general surgeon. My very first rotation in general surgery was at a community hospital. They didn't give me a specific outfit to wear, but I remember going to the doctor's lounge between cases, and I opened the door, and it was immediately apparent that I was younger than all the older white males sitting there, and that this is the demography of general surgeons in Columbus, Ohio. So that was really kind of a eye-opening moment for me, and I think that really shaped who I became and when my interests, and ultimately I became an OBGYN and not a general surgeon. So that was a very interesting experience. But I have also had experiences in the corporate world where I've walked into the room and I'm the only woman, the only Asian woman, the only woman, yeah, in general. So this is a recurring theme that we see among our panelists. I do see some questions popping up in the Q&A. And I think this is a great chance to dive into them. So the concept of trust has come up in terms of communities of color trusting healthcare systems, healthcare providers, and as participants in clinical trials. And the questions are around, there's two of them actually that relate to what can be done to really improve trust with a community that has lost trust in the system. And Robyn, you're shaking your head. Maybe you could lead us off, and then we'll go around from there.
So the issue of trust is huge, and in the Black community, it's decades old. And for obvious reasons, you know, for African Americans, we were enslaved for 250 years, and it's only the last 150 years that we have not been enslaved. And there still have been many prejudices, and Vivian spoke to health equity, and I think it's important that everyone understand that the difference between equity and equality. With equality meaning you give everyone the same thing, equity meaning you give people what they need, and that can be very, very different. Building trust is not an easy matter. I've spoken to, a number of colleagues who are still practicing and who look like me. And even in my conversations with them, I realize that they have implicit biases. So it doesn't have anything to do oftentimes with the way you look. A lot of it has to do with the way we're educated and the information that we've had throughout our lifetimes, whether it's directly through the media or through formal education. And that all of that has instilled in us, as Vivian mentioned, as Deborah mentioned, when it comes to HIV and what people look like, that, I've just heard stories and seen stories and know that they're actually true of what happened to patients when they went in with an unbeknownst diagnosis and how an assumption was made that they must have this because they're a Black male. So how do we get that trust back? I think each of us as clinicians and researchers really needs to do some self-evaluation. We need to be looking at what our biases are, although, again, remember, they're implicit, they're unconscious. So we are not intending to think these things or do these things, but we need to be doing some self-evaluation. And I do believe in training, but not forced training. You have to want to be trained on implicit and unconscious bias, and it has to be interactive. It can't be just looking at a slide set. You need to be in a room with people who don't look like you to really have a full and rich experience. And the other thing is cultural competency. If we're interfacing with patients and potential subjects for trials, then we need to have some cultural competency of how each person, you know, kind of lives their lives and understand that they come to the table with a different paradigm than we do. The distrust in the Black community, as I said, is so real. And there is going to be some education that needs to be done. And I believe it was Deborah that mentioned there have to be more researchers that look like the patients. There have to be more clinicians that look like the patients. So at least they can start out with, you know, an initial trust with thinking, okay, this person looks like me. Odds are they're going to be working on my behalf, rather than coming to the table and from so many experiences thinking that that's not the case. And we hear about it all the time. We hear about the near misses and maternal morbidity, like Serena Williams, who no one listened to her, and who is she but Serena Williams? It's like, I know I have a pulmonary embolism, I've had one before, why aren't you listening to me? So it's listening to those individuals. In terms of trials, it's making the consent easier to understand. The consents are complex for clinical trials. They're several pages long. And I've heard from individuals, you know, Black researchers who are working with patients, and they've said, we have to make the consent easier so that they can not only understand it when they read it, but when I explain it to them, it's perfectly clear that what I'm saying is what they're seeing in front of them. So a few things: having people that look like them, making the informed consent easier to understand, building the trust by having some cultural competency with the folks with whom you're interacting, and having an awareness of yourself of what am I coming to the table with? Am I making assumptions about this person because of the way they look or because of their gender? Which all of that goes into the lack of trust that's here. And it has to start on an individual level. And of course, there's more to be said about policies and what has to happen in terms of being anti-racist, but that's a whole another conversation. And I'll turn it over to one of my colleagues here.
Deborah, would you like to comment from your perspective around trust?
First of all, I would say amen to everything that Robyn said. The only other thing I would add is from, since I did work in the federal government for a very long time, I think that we in the federal government also have a responsibility. I mentioned it in my talk, you know, if we continue to fund majority researchers to do research on minority populations, then we're going to continue to get what we've always gotten. There are now more minority researchers who look like the community that they're trying to study. So when you go into the community, when you enter the community, you automatically have at least a little bit of, I call it cultural fluency with that community, because you need to, and I apologize for the phone in the background, you really need to gain the trust of that community before you can do research. The other thing is that, you know, we oftentimes want to fund research, go in and do the research, take something out of the community, but then what are you leaving behind? So we need to be conscious of that. The other thing, and particularly I saw it with COVID, and, you know, I'm retired from the feds now, and so I only saw it from the outside looking in. But it seems like when the money came out from the CARES Act, the impetus was, let's get the money out quickly, as opposed to getting the money out to where it really needs to go, to those communities that are most impacted. So we really need to look at that and say, what is the goal here? Is the goal to impact those people in the communities that are most impacted, or is the money just get the money out quickly so we can say, check mark, we've done it? So those are things that I think on the federal funding side, those are some of the things that we could look at. Thank you.
Subha, would you like to add anything there about trust and building trust with communities of color?
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you, Ru. You know, I always think that it's never just about trust, but it's always trust and verify, right? So for us, it's important to create these systematic frameworks that allow for verification. So that sort of goes hand in hand. You trust, but you verify. So in thinking about, you know, communities that are underrepresented in clinical trials, could we think about how could they verify that, yes, in fact, we have enrolled more people from the African American or from the Hispanic or from the Asian communities? So I think that verification framework will over time help build that trust. I mean, you know, this casual saying that we all say, in God we trust, but everybody else brings data. And I think bringing data through this verification process is, I think, in my humble opinion, the only way to build trust over time.
Thank you. Vivian, how about you? Trust, communities of color?
Yeah, trust is a huge issue for us, particularly, I want to say, in the technology sector. You know, never mind communities of color, like everybody is having a trust issue with companies in this space. And so I do feel it's critical to the future or to the success, I guess, of anything we try to do, particularly with respect to communities of color. What's interesting about now working in this sector, from having spent my whole life in working in healthcare, is that everything we do is in partnership. So we don't run hospitals, we don't run clinics. And so what we've been doing is being very careful about the partners that we work with, and really thinking about, are we working with partners who are concentrated in the Palo Alto Menlo Park area, or are we really thinking about, you know, the broader America and world that we're trying to serve? So just even during the COVID pandemic, we've set up a number of new partnerships, including one that is being managed out of UAB for the entire state of Alabama, for example. And that's a partnership that we're really excited about because it actually represents communities that we've never actually worked with. We just haven't been that close with folks in Alabama, in Georgia, in South Texas, the Mexican border. So from our point of view, I think it's really the trust that we have to build is partly through being very open about what we're doing and being very clear and transparent with respect to data, since that's where a lot of the distrust may come from. And then to work very closely with our partners and really help support our partners and their relationships, because they're the ones with the direct relationships with patients in the community, and really try to support those relationships.
Great, thank you. We have another really interesting question here about mentorship. Many of the speakers talked about mentorship and the role of mentors and how that, you know, that's been a very pivotal experience in your professional development. The question here was around the gender of the mentor, and have there been any issues where the experience of the person asking the question is that women are supportive of other women as mentors, but sometimes in the concrete, especially with younger women, the women can be seen as rivals. And have you seen that? Has that been an issue? How have you handled it? Subha, maybe you could start us off.
Sure, absolutely. I think Robyn mentioned this. I'm very proud to say that you know, all of my mentors throughout my career have been white men also. I mean, I can't put my finger exactly on why that was. I think it's just that the majority of people in leadership roles in STEM tend to be white men. And those that actually encourage the diverse thought process in a board or on a leadership team, on a leadership committee, really supported women like me and wanted that diverse thought process. So I would say that a lot of my career has been shaped by men, and that's not to say that you cannot have a woman as a mentor. I should say that more and more as I grow in my career, I find that I have a lot of women peer mentors who are my peers, or you know, other women who are in much higher senior leadership positions that are becoming my sponsors. Not to say just mentors, but also sponsors, opening the doors and say, hey, you know, Subha would be great for this committee, or you know, I think we should talk to her about co-authoring this paper, and so on and so forth. So I don't think the gender is particularly important. I think it just was that, you know, in STEM 20 years ago, that was a demographic, but I think it's changing over time, and it's an opportunity for us to support the younger generation as well and become their mentors and sponsors.
Thank you. Deborah, how about you? Do you have any experiences where you found other women supportive in in theory, but maybe less in the concrete? Or what has your experience been with mentors of different sexes?
In terms of mentors, like Subha, when I began, most of the people who were in the public health service in leadership roles were white men. But I will say that, as I moved through my career, I made sure that I tried to mentor others. But in terms of challenges, I will admit that male bosses I have found are easier to work for than female bosses. And maybe that's just my experience. We had civilians as well as commissioned officers, but some of the, like I said, some of the female bosses that I have had been, and I think some of it is a bit of rivalry. I'm there to do my job, you're there to do yours, I don't want your job. But there has been just some, what I thought was unnecessary difficulties in working with some of my female bosses, and maybe it was me, but that's what I have found. And also in terms of supervising, some of the people that I had most difficulty supervising were other Black women who I guess they thought that I was going to slack off and let them slide, but I tried to hold them to the same level of performance that I held everyone else to, and sometimes that generated some conflict. So I'm not going to say it's all been easy, it has not been, and there have been some challenges.
Absolutely, thank you. Vivian, how about you? From your perspective, have you had any different experiences with mentors of different sexes or genders, or how has that played out for you?
Well, I think people can be great mentors, whoever they are, if they're looking after your interests and they're really trying to help you be better. I do have a funny story. One of my mentors was trying to give me good advice once, and this was when we were in New York, and I think I was about to head off to Utah, and he says, you're going to have to really get good at this fundraising thing, right? Because they're a big part about being in academics, being a dean of a medical school is raising money from your donors. And he said, you've just got to learn how to golf. You just got to learn how to golf. I said, Bob, I've got 4 kids under the age of 9. When am I going to get out there and golf? So he buys me this book. I still have it actually on my bookshelf, The Physics of Golf. So just read this, you'll basically figure it out. So sometimes the advice, it's certainly well-intentioned, but I could have done a lot better with, like, how do I manage 17 birthday parties on a weekend? That would have been actually more helpful. I do feel like what Deborah said was a very interesting point about sometimes women are harder to work for, or maybe are more difficult sometimes in the workplace. And I do want to just say that I think that we're still unfortunately at that stage where women are doing disproportionate amount of work in the home. We're seeing, with COVID, it's just going to making everything just all the worse. And so I actually do feel that, we're doing broad stereotyping, right? So this is like, I'm just going to say my own observation is that frequently the women are just under greater stress. They're just, and managing time and then being asked to serve on every committee, because they need a woman on the committee, they need an Asian on the committee, they need an African American on the committee, right? So that's only like 3 of us to choose from. So we get put on every single committee, and then we are supposed to mentor everybody too, and support everybody. So I think it's stressful, and I think just to call that out and say, okay, it's not a level playing field. There are some maybe extra expectations, extra demands, extra burdens, and I think that's been hard. The one other thing I wanted to say also was that, and I only really sort of thought about this when we were creating some of these leadership development programs when I was at NYU, is that, I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what it means to be a good mentee. So maybe Deborah was sort of alluding to that a little bit, like, oh, you're my mentor, you should just do all this for me. But actually, it's a two-way street, and mentees need to do their homework. They need to know what it is they're asking for, what are they asking for specifically, do a little bit of their own thinking, and it's not just a kind of a feed me, kind of a relationship. So And I don't know that everybody really fully understands that. So I think that's really important to realize. And especially if you're looking for female mentors, they're going to be the busiest people that you know. So you really do want to use their time wisely.
Thank you. Thank you. Wise words. And then Robyn, if you could just round it out, mentors and sex and gender of the mentor.
So let me just say, I've never had a manager who was my mentor or my sponsor until recently. I would say my current manager would sponsor me to the moon and back. You know, I have that confidence. But I've never had an experience where it was the manager, my manager, who had that relationship. And it's been through other relationships that I developed from different teams, different committees, interactions, consulting, where almost always, I have to say, I got adopted, not even realizing, because I wasn't even, I mean, I came from a world where I was the captain of the ship in the OR and in the delivery room. So I never even thought about really having someone to mentor or sponsor me for this new career, essentially. And it just happened. I was fortunate that way. But by the same instance, I mean, I've had managers who tried to thwart me, you know, and I'll tell a story, a manager who I'm just in my office working, my computer faced the window so I could see outside, which meant my back faced the door. She walked into my office and said, "Turn around. You are the rudest person I know." And I keep hearing that from other people. And I was like, me? Rude? And it seemed to come out of nowhere. And I realized that the issue didn't have anything to do with me personally and the kind of person that I was. It was more her perspective of me, which to this day, I think, because, you know, I still believe, because I was a Black woman, you know, basically we had come into the company at the same time. She certainly had moved faster than I did, but she still had this grudge. And it didn't turn me against women as mentors or sponsors, but I've just found that the men that I've interacted with have been more willing, who have gone out of their way to say, you can do this, you can do that. I'm going to help you do this. I want you on my team, and this is what we're going to do to get you to my team. And you'd be perfect in this job. And if I haven't recommended you already, I'm going to recommend you. So there was a more giving relationship. And in terms of mentoring young women, that's your job as a leader. It is to mentor young people. And when I say young, it doesn't have to be age, but young in their career. That's your job. That makes you a leader, the willingness to develop other people into leaders. And it's what we should all be doing and thinking as we go through our careers.
Thank you, Robyn. Well, I think we have time for one more question. So if we could just go around for brief responses from all of our panelists. Can you tell us a story where you overcame a challenging situation related to being a woman in the room? And I think Vivian, if you could lead us off, sorry.
Just, can you repeat the question one more time? You cut out just in the middle of it.
Oh yeah, sure. Can you share a story where you overcame a challenging situation related to being a woman in the room?
Tell you many. All right, here's one. So when I first became, this was kind of an early leadership situation where, you know, my approach to, we were trying to develop a strategic plan, and in doing so, my sort of instincts are to learn a little bit about the area, you know, and then to consult with people, you know, to ask people what they think and to get that input. And so I convened a group of experts from within the organization, and I actually asked them what they thought, and we went around and had this discussion. And it got a little heated because, you know, everybody had different viewpoints, and I was just listening. I was trying to listen, although they sort of, I think they thought that whoever spoke the loudest was going to win in this discussion. It was actually a very important strategy that we were trying to work out. People had a strong vested interest in the outcome. And anyway, so at the end of it, the senior most person in the room pulled me aside at the end and said, you know, Vivian, and he was trying to mentor me, he was trying to give me good advice. He said, Vivian, you should never ask people what they think. You should just tell them. just tell them. Asking them is a sign of weakness. So I remember at that moment thinking, wow, this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. You know, I'm going to still ask people, and if you don't like it, well, I don't know, you're going to have to get used to it, because I'm, you know, not going to. But that realization that what I was doing in my instinctive, natural way was really 180 degrees from what I would say the majority of the people in the room thought. That was really kind of an eye-opening experience for me.
Robyn, would you like to go next?
Can you just repeat that question, Ru? I really thought I'd be last this time.
Sorry, I'm just trying to keep everybody on their toes.
It's okay. It's okay.
So what I will say, pause briefly here, there's so many great questions, and I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them, so apologies for everyone who submitted a great question, and maybe we can take them down and have a follow-up discussion at some point. But this question, Robyn, was about a story where you overcame a challenging situation related to being a woman in the room, maybe the only woman in the room or a woman in the room.
So I'm thinking of being on a product development team. That was a urologic product for men, and I'll leave it there. And I was the only woman on the team. And it was in the age of when we were really looking at sexual harassment, and I had to say to myself, is this sexual harassment because this is what we're talking about? You know, this specific condition and the treatment that we have, and does it work or doesn't it? And how long does it work for? And I just had to, I realized I had to step back and be introspective for myself, because I knew everyone on the team, and I had to realize that I wasn't feeling harassed. Okay, first of all, and you know, I don't know if that's good or bad. I wasn't feeling harassed, and maybe it's because, you know, I come from a gynecology perspective that, I mean, we were all laughing, you know, and I was laughing too, and could join in with the guys about laughing, but never at all felt like it had to do with them pointedly saying stuff because I was in the room. And so for me, just overcoming it was not taking it personally, and not feeling like it was pointed at me, that it had to do with the product, it had to do with the condition. These were all things that we had heard, and I will say we weren't in the room. We were on a phone conference, so you couldn't see people's faces. You could only hear their voices. And afterwards, when it was over, I was like, wow, that wasn't good. We shouldn't have been in that space. I shouldn't have had to be in that space. But I think by not making it an issue, I mean, it never happened again. It was one time, one incident. It never impacted the relationship I had on the team. It never impacted the respect that I had on the team or my respect for others. But it was challenging being put in that position and having to look at, how are you feeling about this? Should you react? Is this something you should report? And it was more like my taking an opportunity to respond and not react, and step back and look at the full story and see what had actually happened and whether it really made a difference. And I have to say it really didn't. So it's not taking everything right away at what seems to be face value, but just taking a moment to be introspective and think about it. And particularly if you're not feeling embarrassed. I did not feel embarrassed or harassed at all. And maybe it would have been different if I had felt that way, but I didn't. At that moment, I was like one of the boys, I have to say. So it was just, it was an interesting position to be in, and to just be able to not take it personally and feel like I was being mistreated or looked down upon, or they were bringing it up to see if I would feel bad. And, you know, I'll leave it there. That's.
Thank you, Robyn. How about you, Subha? Do you have a story you can share about being the woman in the room, a woman in the room?
Sure, I have lots of them, but I'll share a small one here in the interest of time. So this was when I was on the board of a startup company. This was a few years ago, and I was the only woman, and I was a non-voting member of the board, but I'd spent quite some time working with the CEO and the product teams for this startup company. And I knew that the CEO was underperforming, and he didn't have great relationships with some of the board members. But it came as a shock to me that the CEO was let go and a new CEO showed up the next day that, I was there for a meeting, and this new CEO that I had never met before. But keeping in mind that I was a non-voting member of the board, but I would have very much appreciated if my input was taken in sort of, creating a short list of members that we would be interviewing for the CEO position. So I made it a point to make this known to every board member outside of the meeting, outside of the boardroom, and I came up with this framework for what an ideal CEO would be for this company, and made sure that I discussed that with each one of the board members. I even created a SWOT analysis for the previous CEO and why he failed. And the next time around this opportunity came up to change the leadership position, I was asked about who should be on that list. So I was glad that it turned around. But more often than not, it so happens that people are not asked for their input, and this very much happens, especially in a board situation. I was glad that I was able to rectify it in this small startup, but here this happens a lot with my peer mentors. I don't think we should be shy about raising the fact that your opinion was not asked and you would like to provide your input.
Thank you, Subha. And I think we just have a couple of minutes. Deborah, if you'd like to share a story of as being the only woman in the room.
Sure. As I said, I did become a Rear Admiral in the Public Health Service, and most of the other admirals were men. I will say, when I walked into, several of the rooms, people knew who I was, and so I was accepted. But as people were talking, I would oftentimes, have to really be assertive to be able to speak. The others would be having their conversations back and forth with each other. And in order to get my word in edgewise, I'd almost have to raise my hand. So, and I think it was Vivian who said, people thought whoever spoke the loudest was the one who was listened to. I don't speak loudly, and to me that's rude. And I think that's something that we as women, we want to make sure everybody is included in the conversation, but sometimes you just have to be really assertive to be able to speak, because we have not maybe the loudest voice, but oftentimes the most important voice, especially if we're the only woman in the room.
Wow, those are great words to close with. Thank you so much to our panelists. It's been a great discussion. At this point, I'm going to close this section and I'm going to hand it back to Maura for instructions on what to do next. Thank you, Robyn, Subha, Deborah, Vivian. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope our audience has too. From the questions, it seems like people were very interested in your responses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to say we've been getting amazing feedback for this session. So yeah, Deborah, Subha, Vivian, and Robyn, and Ru, thank you so much for moderating. This has been a great discussion, and if the symposium went on for another 18 hours, I would happily listen to you all. But sadly, we've got to close out the session. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all for your questions. And a recording will be made available, so you'll be able to watch again and again. And I invite you all to head over to the closing ceremony.